and welcome to the Cooking Chapel. I'm your host, Reverend Kyle, and today we are going to be making Goetta. What is Goetta? My grandfather was a butcher in Covington, Kentucky back in the 50s, and I can remember him making homemade Goetta for everyone. Goetta is actually a German-American dish with a primary purpose of stretching out the food to make it last longer. While its true beginnings are a mystery, we do know this. It showed up sometime in the 19th century and seems to be easy to come by in butcher shops around northern Kentucky. While there are dozens of recipes around, they are all centered around the same core components: meat, oats, and seasonings. First, let's talk about the meat. What I have here is 1 pound of ground pork, and I also have 1 pound of ground beef. Now, traditionally, Grandpa would have used leftover pork or leftover beef that he had from other meals, and he would use that. So there was no remains, there were no throwaways or leftovers back in the day. You would use every little piece of meat that you had. So that's what Grandpa would have done. Today, what we're going to use for simplicity's sake is just ground pork and ground beef. I have seen combinations where it's just beef or just pork. Grandpa actually tried it with turkey at one point. But the key is having the ground beef helps it to cook and incorporate much easier. Now, you do want to get ground pork. You don't want to get ground sausage. You definitely don't want to go get the breakfast sausage in a tube. Those things already have spices added to them. So you don't want to, you want to resist the temptation to go do that. In terms of the beef, I like to use a 73% beef to fat ratio. That way you actually do have a lot of the oils and the fat that the oats are going to soak up. So when it comes time for frying, you don't have to add any extra oil to it. Next, let's talk about the oats. We're used to seeing traditional rolled oats, which would be what you would use for oatmeal or cookies or something that, a cereal type of oat. The type of oats we're going to use for Goetta are actually called steel cut oats. These are closer to their original shape and size, but they've been chopped up, probably by steel cutting, thus the name steel cut oats. They're also referred to as Irish oats or pinhead oats. Regardless, they're a lot coarser, and so when they soak up the fats from the meat and the juices and the seasonings, it gives it a lot different texture. If you were to try to use these oats, your traditional rolled oats with Goetta, it would be a mushy mess. You wouldn't want to do that. So definitely the steel cut oats. Now you can find these at most natural food stores or health food stores. You may get lucky and find them on your shelf at your local grocer, although I was not able to do so. Our Goetta recipe today is actually going to call for 3 cups of the steel cut oats. So now we get to the point of controversy with most Goetta recipes, the spices, the seasonings. Now, I've looked at several dozen Goetta recipes online, and there seems to be some commonalities and some other things that people like to argue about. And so I'm going to tell you my personal seasonings combination and let you decide whether you like it or whether you need to do something to tweak it to your own personal taste. So we're going to start off here, the obvious items. We do have onion and garlic. Now I do use 1 full biggest onion I can get, and I'm going to chop that up as fine as I can get it. Same with the garlic. I'm actually going to use about 3, maybe 4 cloves. I do like a lot of garlic in my Goetta. Then we have bay leaves here. That seems to be one piece that nobody disagrees with, is that Goetta has to have bay leaves. As many of them as you could possibly see. I've actually seen one recipe that called for like 20, which is, I don't know, maybe a little overkill. I like to use anywhere from 3 to 5 big ones. Now, the problem with the bay leaves is when you're cooking Goetta, it slowly thickens. And so you don't want to actually lose your bay leaves and then find them later in a pound of it as you're cooking. That's just not what you want. So what I have actually found is that if you put the bay leaves into some cheesecloth, tie it up, and then throw it into the batch, it makes it much easier to find. And I usually take the bay leaves out before it gets super thick, so as not to just, it causes a kind of a nasty mess. Then we have what I consider to be my secret ingredient. Now, there's been a lot of people online who have said sage or thyme or rosemary or all of these different things. And I came to the conclusion that the ultimate combination is actually just your standard poultry seasoning. So I go to my local grocer and I pick up their standard container of poultry seasoning. Seems to be that perfect amount. So what I'm going to use here is a little bit more than a tablespoon for the recipe that we're going to make today. Heaping tablespoon, more or less to taste. Then we have salt. We also have a little over a tablespoon, again heaping a tablespoon of just plain salt. And then we have black pepper. I like to use a teaspoon of black pepper. Some people like their Goetta a little bit more peppery. You can always add that as you're going through and cooking. Now I do have to warn you, as you're cooking the Goetta, you're going to be tempted to taste it. And the taste in its cooked form in the pot before it gets fried, it's supposed to be slightly bland. It's not until after it fries does the true flavor actually come out. So don't be tempted to overdo any of this in hopes to get it to taste correct before you fry it, because then when you do fry it, it'll be disastrous. Okay, I've just turned on my water here. I have 8 cups of cold water, and I've just turned my stove on to high. And so into this cold water, I'm going to add my ingredients. I have my finely chopped onion and my finely chopped garlic. And again, those are, in my opinion, very important pieces of the Goetta recipe. And then my poultry seasoning. Again, that's a little over a tablespoon, a heaping tablespoon. A heaping tablespoon of just plain salt. And then a teaspoon of black pepper, more or less to taste. And then, of course, the bay leaves. Now, like I said before, I attempted the bay leaves loose. They're rather hard to find later on, but if you put them in some cheesecloth and tie them off and throw them in there, that will make it easier to find them later. So what you're going to do is you're actually just going to get this going, and as this water is slowly coming up to a boil, the next step is to actually add the meat itself. The way I add the meat is I actually just take it, and instead of just dumping it in, I like to break it up, little pieces at a time. What you ultimately want to do is, as the meat cooks, you want the oils and the fats and all of that to kind of come apart and become part of this broth. Basically, it's a Goetta broth. So we're going to break up here all of the meat. And let's get that was the pork, and then this is the actual beef itself. Now, whenever you're cooking food like this, I do want to recommend cleanliness. I've washed my hands thousands of times in this process. I want to recommend that you do the same, especially if you are going to share this recipe. Once you get done with this, you are going to end up with about 6 pounds of Goetta, which may be enough for your family, or you may want to share some with your friends and relatives. So cleanliness, very important. So we're just going to let that sit here, and we are going to let it boil. And as it boils, you'll smell the aromatics coming out. And ultimately, once it starts boiling, you're looking for a froth. So you're going to end up with this white layer of froth. It's going to be fat, and it's going to be meat, and it's going to be amazing smelling. All right, well, my froth is starting to kick in here, and you can kind of see it along the edges there. I've turned my water down. I've turned it all the way off here, so the froth will actually sit down here for a moment. I just want to show you how it's looking. The meat itself is cooked completely at this point, and any big chunks you'll be able to break up. And this only took a few minutes, really, just to get it all up and going here. The froth kind of overdid it on me, so I had to turn it down here. Once you've gotten it to this point, the next step is actually to, like I said, once you break up the meat a little bit, the bigger chunks, You're going to add your oats. And the rest of the chunks, don't worry about it if you have too many. The rest of them will actually break up as the oats start to incorporate and start to boil in. So I'm going to turn this back up. So it's back up to high heat. And I'm going to pour in 3 cups. And this is 3 cups of the steel cut oats. And really, this is your final step in terms of putting items in your pot. You're not going to add anything else to the pot. Your bay leaves are still in here. You definitely want that. You want this to come to a boil. And once it comes to a boil, you're going to let it simmer. So we'll just give it a second here. It should start boiling again here rather quickly. Again, the smell is just amazing. Your whole house is going to thank you for making this meal. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and turn it back down to low. And I'm going to put a lid on it. Now, I'm using a non-stick pot. If you don't have a non-stick pot, I would recommend stirring this as much as humanly possible. Then again, don't leave the lid off too long. You don't want to lose any of the moisture. You want the moisture to soak in to the grain, into the oats. That's the whole point here, is that the oats are soaking up all of the fluids, all of the fats, and kind of incorporating and congealing everything together. You're looking at a boil time here, a simmer time of probably about an hour to an hour and a half. I've seen it go up as long as 2 hours. It depends on the temperature and humidity and whatnot. Obviously, if you're somewhere like Colorado or Arizona, you may have different cooking times. So we'll come back to it once it's gotten a little thicker, and I'll show you what you got to look forward to. Okay, let's check out our Goetta. Now, it's been cooking for an hour or so. Actually, it's probably been over an hour at this point. And your Goetta should look like this, very thick, very dense. You probably have come in and stirred it several times over the course of the last hour or so. And most of the online recipes say that if you can stick your spoon in there and it stays upright on its own, that it's done. It's probably been able to do that for the last 20 minutes or so. Really what you're looking for is you're looking for all of the fluid, the water that pools on the top, to be gone. Because without that, you're going to end up with a very runny mess once it comes out and cools. Now, I do see here is my my cheesecloth with the bay leaves. I'm just going to go ahead and take that out. At this point, you don't need it. I mean, the flavor's in there or the flavor's not. So you really want to get that out there before it gets too thick and it disappears on you. You may actually have to go looking for it. A few minutes ago, before I actually showed you where I stand with this, I took what I call a core sample. Now, this is a small amount, maybe about half a cup, of the Goetta out of the container, and I threw it in the freezer. Now what I'm doing is I'm trying to tell it to quickly congeal. This tells me whether or not it's ready to go, whether it's done or not. And it's very, it almost looks gelatinous in the way that it has come together. And that's an indication that this Goetta is done. So for anything else, really, this is done. You can taste it at this point, and really it's going to, like I said before, going to be very bland. Or you can do what I like to do and get a skillet ready, because once this core is cooled down and ready to go, you can go ahead and fry it up. Alright, so I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to scoop it right in to my skillet. Now this skillet is set on medium heat, and I'm just going to let this fry. Now the amount of time that it takes to fry Goetta is really dependent on how thick you actually put it into the skillet, how you actually like it cooked, and ultimately it's personal preference. You could eat it right now by itself the way it is. To me, that's pointless because you're not releasing all of those aromatics and all of those flavors. Many people like to have their Goetta goopy. As a matter of fact, a lot of Cincinnati restaurants, if you go and you order Goetta, it's just one big flat slab, and it's just cooked, and it's completely crispy. But most of the time, if you go to someone's house, someone who's been eating Goetta their whole life, they're going to serve it to you a little bit more on the goopy side. So it's cooked on both ends, but then it's still got some goopiness in the middle. And what you'll notice is that Goetta actually, you want to cook it kind of low and slow. And so medium heat, medium to low heat, it's just really going to depend. Notice that you don't have to put any oil in here at all. The oils from the meat and the fat have all soaked into the oats at this point. So you're really getting, at this point, with this core sample from our pot, this is going to be the freshest, richest flavored Goetta that you're going to get. Not to say anything about the rest of it, but this is really going to give you a perfect example of what the flavor is going to be. So it's been sizzling here for a little while. I'm going to show you what happens if I decide to flip it. Oh yeah, there you go. Now again, you're looking for browning. You're looking for browning similar to if you were to brown ground beef for a sauce or something of that nature. You don't want to kill it, but then again, you don't want to leave it too raw. And I like to break mine up. I think it cooks faster that way. I think it cooks a lot more uniformly. But then again, other people like to leave it in slabs, and that's fine. Now, just as a side note, I do have my other Goetta from the pot. The pot is off of the heat, and it's actually going to start cooling. We want it to cool just a little bit before we put it in a container and get it into its final form. So I'm just going to let this sizzle here for a bit, and I'll come back when it's done. This is really starting to smell delicious. And it's coming up really nice, brown. Like I said, I break mine up a little bit. This is like my mama used to make. Actually, that's not true. My mom does like it a little bit goopier than this. But this is exactly how I think Goetta should be. Nice and crispy. You can still see on the inside there's just a tiny little bit of its natural color. It's nice and brown and dark. This is ready for consumption. So my assistant Elizabeth here is putting on the final touches of the Goetta. What she's done is she's scooped all of our Goetta into a 9 by 13 inch baking dish. And this here, once it cools, so you can put this directly into the refrigerator, once this cools, can be cut into 6 pieces. Each of those 6 pieces should equal about a pound. 1 pound should be enough to feed a family of 4 very comfortably. Now, Goetta is typically kept in the refrigerator, wrapped in cellophane or aluminum foil for about a week. If you put it into the freezer in this form, it can stay as good maybe a month or so. Just make sure you do defrost it completely before you try cooking it again. With that being said, I do have my core sample here, and now in traditional sense, most people will just eat this plain, although I have heard people put maple syrup, ketchup, all sorts of crazy things on it, but we like to eat it plain. So why don't you do the honors here?
Delicious.
You like that?
There you go.
All right. So I do want to thank you all for joining us here at the Cooking Chapel. We hope to make this a regular show, and if you have any requests, please be sure to send them in. Thank you for watching.